Welcome to Techie Talks AI by Schogini. Here's another amazing project from our AI Internship program students. Let's get started.
So today I'm going to talk to you all about how I made my first ever CRUD project. CRUD as in create, read, update, and delete data. So as a part of my first CRUD project, I made a to-do list using, of course, Python Flask and a bunch of other HTML templates over here. And of course, this is how I styled my first CRUD application. So let's get started with that. So as a part of my first step, I wanted to make a virtual environment, create my first CRUD project, right? And this is the first command I gave on that regard. I wanted PowerShell to bypass its own policy of preventing us from running scripts. Yes, that is a policy that PowerShell has, but it took me a lot of time to find out that was a problem. So depending on your OS, like whether it's iOS or Windows, it can be completely different for you to start a virtual environment. Like the set of codes that you need to give your terminal would be completely different based on your OS. And in my case, since it's Windows, this is the set of commands that I had to give the terminal to start my own personal virtual environment. And I believe virtual environment is a convenient step to make in order to start our CRUD project because when we are making a project like this, we use a lot of extensions, a lot of libraries and such. So it's just easier, more convenient if we just use all those, download all those extensions and set libraries into a virtual environment instead of, downloading it into our own personal system or something. It's just easier that way. So, as a part of that, this is a code I gave to personally activate my virtual environment. So this was the one I used to bypass PowerShell's script policy. But this is the code I gave env scripts activate.ps1 to start my or activate my personal, what do you say, virtual environment. Yeah. And once you activate it, you see a bunch of files over here that automatically get created. It's automatic. You don't have to do anything over here. It just starts on its own. And once that is done, you have your own virtual environment. And make sure when you start it, you see these three letters over here. You see this one word over here, because this is how terminal lets us know that our virtual environment is active. So if you don't see these three letters over here, it means you haven't successfully started it yet. All right. Okay, now that I have my virtual environment all set up, one thing to note over here that's important is that you can deactivate it whenever you want. You just type deactivate, and so you can just go deactivate and just turn the virtual environment off just like that. It's that simple. So that's just how it goes. Once you deactivate it, you can just reactivate it again by using the same set of codes over here. For example, okay, I copy it and paste over here. And once I go over here, the next one, I just do the same thing. There you go. It's activated again. And once you activate it, now we need to install all the necessary extensions and libraries and such over here. That's our next task. So we can go pip and install. Since I've already installed these necessary libraries, I don't have to do this again. But for anyone who does it for the first time, we can just go pip install and give the necessary libraries over here, as in Flask, SQL Alchemy, and in my case, I also imported SAS just so I could style it better. I simply prefer using SAS for the styling in this case, but it is not necessary at all. So as I was saying, so in order to start your library, you just need to, yeah, write pip install and then give out the names of every library that you need for that particular project, right? That's why we use a virtual environment in the first place, right? we just install whatever extensions and libraries that we need for that particular project. And instead of downloading it or installing it into our own personal system, we just put it in the environment, like I said before. So that's easy. So this is it. But since I've already imported and installed all this, I don't need to activate it right now. It's unnecessary. But I just wanted to show you how you do it, right? And we can also do another step over here. It's called Python freeze and greater symbol. Oops. And requirements dot text. So what this does is that it automatically creates another extra file in the folder over here called requirements dot text, right? And it lists down one by one each and every extensions libraries and other things that we need for this, in this case, for this particular project, right? Since I downloaded all these three libraries, that is Flask and SAS and SQL Alchemy. These are the other extra extensions that came with it, but in general, these are the three, what do you say, libraries that we need for this particular project. That's it. But this is just to show you the list of everything that you need in this case, right? And that's that. And in this case, SAS is another extension too. So make sure that you actually download the extension for SAS as well, which in this case, let me show you. Yeah, here you need to go out of your way and install the extension for SAS to make this work, which is necessary. Yeah. But the thing is, sorry, SAS itself is not that necessary at all. Like you can use regular CSS to code your styles and everything, whatever you need. I just preferred using SAS in this case. It's just more convenient for me, and that's how it is. So there you go. And now we go to our file, app.py. Yeah. Make sure you create the file called app.py as your first step, right? And here I just went like app equals of object Flask, and we just this can be presumably the name of the web application that we are creating using Flask. This line of code right here comes as a default for most Flask projects and whatnot. And yeah, that's the first line we come up with usually. First we import everything that we need over here, then we go app equals Flask. And since there are a lot of codes over here, we can just ignore it for now. I'll get to it later. And then, but as a next step, we go create a function over here, index. This is basically a decorator, a Python decorator, which we use to create a route to our index page, or in this case, our home page. This is just a decorator that just creates and establishes a route to our home page of whatever web application we are creating using Python. And as a next step of our basic line of code, we type in this, okay, this little part of line, call if name equal main with app, and that's about. Ooh, and apologies. One thing to note over here, these are all things I added later on. The first and foremost, if you're starting this out, first thing you write over here would be this line, and then app run equals debug. This is simply a line I added just so I could change my server port to 7,000 instead of, let's say, 5,000. So as you all know, whenever we open whatever web application in Python we open it on a default server port when we're opening it at live server. So I wanted to change that to 7,000 just to see if I can try it, just to learn. But it's not really necessary as such, but you can add it if you want or not, depends on what you want. But yeah, this line is entirely necessary. It's default. Okay, now that I've explained what a basic layout for an app.py file would look like, let's now go to the other concepts such as templates and such. Now, before I go more into it, I want to show you some important steps to do over here. See, I've created two extra folders over here, right? One's called templates, one called static. right? And over here in templates, we would be storing all of our other HTML templates in. And these templates would consist of different routes or different pages within our web page. So if you look at any other websites in general, each and every website would usually have multiple pages together in one web page, right? One application would consist of different web pages, right? And these are the templates for each of those web pages. And that's the concept of it, basically. And in case of static, we have our style sheet, right? In my case, since I'm using Sass, I've created another style sheet called styles.scss instead of CSS. Make sure if you're using Sass, you go here to the extensions and download the extension for Sass and an extension called Live Sass Compiler. Now, why do you need a compiler? In this case, since we are converting Sass, we're compiling Sass from S to CSS in real time, right? We're actually changing Sass to CSS, my bad, CSS in real time. And for that purpose, we need a live Sass compiler. Once you've got that going, once you've enabled both Sass and the Sass compiler, we're going to go here. We're going to create the file called styles.scss and make sure before you start your styling and everything over here, you go down to the bottom over here. You will have an option called Watch Sass. Now, it's very important that you click on this before you get started over here if you're using Sass, because this is what helps you compile your code over here from SCSS to, let's say, CSS over here. And this is a file that you would not have to worry about. It all happens on its own over here, so that's a different story. But yeah, that's how it's done for the most part. Now, once you've styled over here, let's go to our template, right? Now we need to link our style sheet to the base HTML template, right? So that it can be connected to our web page, right? We need our styling to reach over here. We need our style sheet to reach all the way here. How do we do that? In case of templates, we have a syntax language called Jinja, right? And for the common syntax for that is usually two curly braces, right? And that's how it usually goes. We use two curly braces to connect our style sheet over here. And that's how it is. So what's the logic over here? So we go for URL for instead of typing the, let's say, stylesheet.css or something like that, styles.css or something like that, just normally. Here we are linking our file using Jinja. So how it goes is that we use two curly braces, as I said before, and we go URL for parenthesis, and we start with our folder name. In this case is static, right? Then our file name, of course, which is styles.css in this case, right? Once we link it, I'll just show you how the website final is right now. See, this is how I styled it in this case, and you can see how we managed to link the style sheet to the main web application over here successfully. So that's how it goes for the most part. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Now let's get started with how templates work, right? Okay, now, so speaking of templates, what exactly is a template over here? So let's say we have a base HTML file, right? A complete base one. How does it go over there? This base HTML file then we inherit the basic template, let's say the boilerplate for an HTML document and everything, including the styling, the style sheet and everything. We inherit this basic HTML layout or boilerplate from this base HTML or from this parent HTML document. into other HTML, into other documents, let's say index HTML and such, right? Let's call them child templates over here for the sake of the example, right? So from this main HTML document, we are inheriting the basic HTML templates repeatedly into other HTML documents. Let's say, like I told you before, each websites would have multiple web pages, right? And each of these extra web pages would be inheriting their basic format from this base HTML document, as well as the styling. Okay, so we're also inheriting the style sheet from this base HTML document. So we don't have to keep typing all this repeatedly for each and every HTML document out there. So that's the basic idea of why we need templates, right? And before I go into the other main templates over here, I want to design my table, right? I wanted to design my table. Now that I already have it designed over here, but before you mainly go into the table design, I created a simple another extra HTML document over here called testing. It's not really part of this web page at all. It's not really part of the app file or anything. I just created this just so I could create my table first over here before live testing it, you know? So I wanted a layout of how the table would look like before I actually added it into our HTML document or anything, right? So what do we have over here? Content over here. This inside div, we have everything that's going to be included in our app, right? In our app.pack. So this is going to be the basic layout of how the table looks like. If you look over here inside table, we have table rows. And inside rows, we also have the names for each of the three columns of the table, right? Task, added, and action. So let me just take you to the web page. Okay, so you can already see over here, we have task over here, added, and action. This would be how our columns are going to be named. We have table heads. That's the tag that we give for the name of the columns, table head. These are table rows. So once I given the names for my columns, we're gonna go into the data itself, data aspect of the table itself, right? So we go for another table row over here and table data. I've added three sets of data over here. So let's go a little bit more into that. Content would be, since this is a to-do list, going back to the web page, yeah, to-do list. See, we have cleaning over here, cooking over here, just the basic examples as such. So this would be the content itself of the table, right? Since it's a to-do list, the content would be tasks or things that we have to do for the day, right? And date, of course, this is pretty self-explanatory, I guess. The date at which when it was added, when the task was added, so that we can keep a track of when things were added and we can remove things as such as well. And more would be the option to edit and delete said task, right? So we have the option now, if once we complete it, we can delete them. Or once we have an extra task coming up, we can also edit the existing task over here. So these are the part that's included in the more side of things, right? And that's how it is. That's how I added my data over here in the table. This is the basic layout of everything that's included in the table. So I haven't, this isn't connected to any of the web pages at all. I just added here just so I could create it in the first place. Okay, so we have two extra lines of code over here. These are inputs, right? These are our inputs right here. So as you can see in our CRUD project over here, we have task and we can also add extra task over here. So there are two inputs in this case, right? We have our content itself and we are adding the text itself, and then I added a submit button for the text. So we can add in whatever content In this case, our content is, of course, the task we need to do. And we also added a submit button for the content, right? That's how we add new content over here. So now that that's explained over here, let's get started with our templates, right? So what we have here is our basic template, as I have explained before. And from this basic template, each and every other, let's say, HTML files is going to inherit the, let's say, the boilerplate or the basic layout of every HTML file over here. So we don't have to keep typing this in each and every HTML file that we use. We can just use this template, create template blocks, and inject all of this into our other HTML files, right? And that's why it's easier this way, so that we don't have to keep typing each and every part of this in every HTML file. So how this works is that if the base HTML file is our parent template, right? If this is a parent template, the other, let's call it child templates over here, they inherit, extends in this case means they inherit whatever code from this file, in this case base HTML, and this child template inherits everything from the previous base HTML file as a template. And how this works is that we use a certain thing called template blocks, right? This is just a simple syntax, a Jinja syntax right here. So we, as you can see, we add curly braces and then percentage. Inside that, we create space and we write first block. And the name can be whatever we want for the particular block, right? In this case, since it's a head, I add a block head. I haven't added anything to the block head over here. It's an option. I can add anything I want to the head if I wanted to by bringing block head over here, but I never did. But in case of the title, I've added another block called block title. And then I added my title over here, which is how the name for the title gets, let's say, injected into the base HTML file over here, right? This is how templates are created. We combine our basic template format into other HTML files, and we create a properly well-coded HTML file every single time, so that the basic default lines that we need to add to every single HTML file, we don't have to type it in every single time. It's just easier work that way, right? So that's how templates go. And now that I explained over here what templates are, I've created a title block and I've created a body template block as well, right? And in the body block is where I added all my table layout, like all the code I needed to make my table, I've added over here inside the body, so I wouldn't even need anything over here. Everything I need for the table just gets injected in over here because of the template blocks. And now we have a proper file for our table, for our index page, right? And as you can see, here I added an extra template over here. This is not exactly a template block, not at all. But this is just in case if there is no task added, as in, let's say, for example, if I wanted to add a task over here and I say add a task, let's say we wanna delete each task, right? Let's say let's try that for a second over here, right? So there you go. There are no tasks, right? This does not show on its own, obviously. So that's where this particular line of code comes useful, right? Because if, for example, we have no task at hand, we need to delete all the remaining tasks out there from the table, then there's no longer a table over here. So that's where we added in this particular line. So that's just the use of it. And down here, we have everything else we needed for the table. This also includes everything that we made over here in the testing HTML file. So we added the basic layout of the table and more over here as part of the template. What's more important to note over here is that we have an if condition over here, right? That's a condition that if we have a table, if we don't have a table, excuse me, if we don't have a table, then this particular string is executed over here. Otherwise, else we bring the table, of course, naturally. We have the basic layout of the table as I've explained before, the three column heads and the more data for the rows over here is added over here. So in this case, I just gave it a basic name for the data as it is, like content, data, more. But now we're going to actually create the data itself over here. We have the content itself over here. That's the name of the task. We have the format for the date over here, which is YMD, which is just a normal format for adding in the date and time over here. Then in more, as you can see over here, we added the option to delete and the option to edit over here. That's our template right here. We have the layout for the table created, and down here we have the input and the method for the input over here, post, which is the server method to give data, right? And that's pretty much it. That's our layout for the index page of our app. This is just it. Once we've created the table, now our job is to add data, right? But we cannot simply just type an input and just expect it to be saved, right? For example, over here, if I needed to, let's say, add another task called cleaning, it needs to go to a database, right? It needs to be stored. The input needs to be stored into a database. That's where this comes useful. That's where we imported SQL Alchemy as our database, right? And one thing I forgot to mention, for which I apologize, is the render template, right? So whenever we need to inherit templates over here, we also need to import our render template over here. But this is just a simple step, but that's pretty much it. This is just for our templates. Yeah. Coming back to our database, I've imported SQL Alchemy, as I mentioned before, as part of creating our virtual environment. SQL Alchemy is one of the things that we imported in, right? And this is going to be our database, right? So we're going to use SQL Alchemy to create or configure, in this case, our database, which in this case I named over here as SQLite database.db. This is going to be our database, right? And this is how I've connected my database to my app over here. This is the line of code for that, right? And now let's just go to the part where I add in the rows of data. This is how I configured the part of the table where I add in the data as in the task and when it was added and the option to delete and edit and everything. This is where I code the necessary lines for so that I can make the table work, right? So as a first step, I'm gonna add in the rows of data over here, right? That includes the content itself, the task at hand, and how it was created over here, which is the time. Yeah, so as I mentioned before, this is where everything regarding creating the table and like actually making the table happens. That includes the code to actually delete and edit tasks like this, and also the code to add our data in, like as in add our task at hand in, right? For example, over here we have cleaning and cooking. This is how we add the task to the table itself, right? What we did over here is just design the layout of the table. This is where we make the table actually function, right? So as a part of making the table work, what does it include, right? We know for a fact that we're going to add in data and we're going to edit and delete it, whatever we need. But most importantly, we're going to add and retrieve our necessary data. How we're going to do that is we're going to connect our app to a database, right? So here, as I mentioned before, I've included or imported the library for SQL Alchemy, right? It's integrated with Flask as mentioned over here. So this is a database that we're going to use for our table. This is how we're going to retrieve and input in data as we need it, right? So what we need to do regarding that is we need to configure our database first. So I've configured my database over here, SQL Alchemy. It's all in caps. Over here, database URI equal to, since we're using SQLite over here, and we mentioned SQLite first, and then we name our database. I just kept it as simple as possible over here. Just named it database itself, database.db. But we can give our database any name we want, project, database, whatever you need. You can just name it whatever you want, of course. Then I'm going to create the database itself. Database equals like an object of SQL Alchemy, and I just dropped in the app itself into here, into the parenthesis. And that's it. We've created our database and connected our database. So then the task at hand would be to create a model for the database, as in like each of the rows we're gonna add data to each of the rows of the table, right? So we're gonna create the code so that we can make that happen. We're gonna add different types of data to each of the rows of the table. We could call a model in this case, and we're gonna create the model over here where we add the data. So as a part of that, I'm going to create my class over here and we're going to add in my model, TB model. And each of the tasks inside the table would have a unique ID, right? A serial number or an ID. Like, for example, you might have seen in tables before where each of the data in the table would have a serial number to the side, 1, 2, 3, and so on. So even though it's not shown over here, the app identifies each task with a primary unique key value that happens to be an integer, right? So each of the tasks would have a unique value by which it is identified, right? So for example, even if I give the two same task over here would still be added and Python would still be able to identify each of these tasks by its unique primary key value, which is going to be true over here, of course. So that's how it is. And more importantly, we have our content itself, the data, which obviously you can figure it out that it's a string, right? These are words, so it's a string. So we have a string, and how many words can be, alphabets can we add to a task? In this case, I gave it 100. So the length of any task I add over here can have up to 100 alphabets or let's say words inside the the column over here, inside the blank over here. So I've added the limit of up to 100 words, 100 alphabets, and nullable as in it cannot be left empty, right? Task cannot be empty. It needs to have some kind of task over here to make it work. So that's it. So the last line over here, right? What do we have over here? We have, for example, at hand, each task and the day or the date in this case at which it was added, right? So this is how I made that possible. The last line over here, it's called created db column because it's added to a column. It's the name of the column. And then we have daytime default, and UTC now. This is how the app adds in the date for each task over here. This is just a default logic that we use to make that happen. So for every task over here, I'm going to add in the date, and this is how that I made that possible. over here, we've finally created the model, but it doesn't do anything, right? We needed to return the values of the data back onto our screen like this, like what I showed over here, right? So this is how we do that, right? We added this task over here. We added the ID for the unique ID for the task itself, right? And it's returned as a F string. And that's pretty much it. This is how we return the data that is added over here, added into our database. And this is how we return that said data back to our screen. And now there's also one more final step that we need to add to finally create, like properly create our database, right? Like since we configured it and created it over here, of course, and everything, we need to make it visible over here as well. We need to finally actually create the proper database properly, right? And as a step towards that, let's go down to the bottom over here. And as you can see, we need to add a context over here, right? And within context, I created database and create. That's it. It's that simple. So this line of code right here, this piece of code over here, it actually creates the data. Once you type this piece of code in and run the program itself, it will automatically create a database right over here, which is instance. There you go. Yep, there you go. We have a database now finally created over here once you type this in and run the code over here. And that's pretty much it. As far as the database is concerned, you've done everything you need over here once you've completed this step as part of all this over here. Okay, now so we're done with the database. Now that we're done with the database over here, let's go to our home page, right? Our index over here. This is the common route we add for our index page. This is the decorator over here, and as part of the decorator, as I mentioned before, we add our route, and our route to our index page is just represented by a slash over here. That's it. But what all methods do we use for our index page, right? That it's that simple. So what we have here is I've added a small hashtag over here just so to let you know, just to make things simpler. Here we have the complete logic, and I mean complete logic to add in a completely new task. So this is the piece of code that makes this work. So if I want to add a completely new task, like let's say running, and I click add task. Now it's visible on the screen. Now it's visible on the table. Like it's actually added to the table. This is how it works. So if we don't have this piece of code, it's not going to work. Even if we add it, it's not going to show. It's not going to be displayed on screen, right? So this logic right here is what makes that possible. What makes adding a new task to our table possible right there. Same with over here, we added a decorator and a route to delete our data. So even if we delete, we needed to go back to the server and actually delete it. So this is how we make that possible. So this would be the logic adding and deleting a task over here. So if we need to add a new task or if we need to delete a task at hand, as we mentioned over here, this is the logic behind it. This is the code that makes that possible. So even if we had an add or delete option over here, this would not work at all unless and until we add all this logic over here in our app file, right? So, but before we do that, you also need to make sure you add in these two methods right here, right? Redirect and request. These two methods are very important if you're planning to do all this over here, right? So this would be a simple logic, and this is all you need to add a completely new task, right? We have our method that is post. We are giving data to the server, right? We are giving our data to the database. So the method for that would be post. We are giving data. And our current task would be to gather all the content. Once we give the data, we are making it visible using the database, right? We are retrieving the data from the database and we are making it visible. And over here, we make that happen by referencing form, right? The content and the form itself. We have our form over here. See, as you can see, the method over here is post. This entire thing is being referenced and brought out over here. This is why this part is useful. We are bringing it over here to gather our content right here, right? So this would be the logic to adding a new task and making it visible as well. So the basis of all this would be we are giving information to inputs to the HTML file over here. And by the way, we also reference HTML file over here, as you can see, render template. We've referenced the index.html file over here in our app using render template. And once we reference that, we connected the HTML file to the app file over here, right? And once we connected that, we also have inputs over here. And this is how we add in our data. This is how we give information to our HTML file. But that information is received over here using the form request over here. You reference the content and the form itself over here. This is how app connects itself and gets the data from the inputs over here. So whatever input as data we give over here, this is how the app file gets it. This is how the app file receives all that data over here, right? But the method itself is post since we're adding a new task. So it's post. So by typing in all of this, we now have what the user entered in as new data, right? What do we have over here? We have, this is how we add a new task, right? As I mentioned before. And we created a new task, a variable over here and we referenced it as an object of the model we created over here. See, this is how it is. So we created a new task, and this task at hand is an object of the model over here. The model is named my task, right? This is the first model, and this task is an object of that particular model over here, of that particular class over here. Once we got that over with, right? Once we got the part of adding a new task over with, we're going to add that data all the way to the database. We need to give it to the database, right? We need to connect our database and send all that data to said database. This is where that happens. So we need to connect to the database first. So in order to make that happen, I need to create a session with the database first. So I need to create a session so that I can open my connection with the database. And here, what are we going to do? What's our method over here? We're going to add a new task, right? Once we added a new task, we're referencing that new task over here. And once we created that session, we're going to commit to that session as well. This is how we give data to our database. So we add in our new task by creating a session and we're going to commit that in the database. So what is this exactly, right? What is this exactly? So this is simply a syntax used by SQLite, which is just Python's inbuilt version of SQL. As I've mentioned over here, we're using SQLite in this case to create and use the database, right? So I'm creating a session with my database using SQLite as a syntax, and I'm adding a new task over here. We reference a new task and I'm committing that to the database. This is how we add data to our database. This is the logic behind it. But once I've added the data to my database, I need to come back. I need to return back to my home page, which is where this line comes into use, right? I return and redirect back to the route for my home page. This is a route we've added over here. So this is a route to the homepage. This is how we come back to the homepage. Now, since I've added try over here, I also need an set down here just because I need to make this work, right? That's the simple logic of it. So I've added exception as E, and I printed E, and I'm returning error E2 just because I'm returning things over here. So we need to make this work without any error. So I'm just returning E over here as well. And since the method I'm using over here is used under an if condition, I'm using an if condition to make all of this happen, right? So I also need an else condition contrary to that. I need an else condition parallel to that as well. So that's what we have over here. So what does this mean exactly, right? If I'm not adding a task, else I'm just seeing all the current task at hand. So this is how I'm visualizing or presenting all the current task over here. So if I'm not adding a task, I'm simply seeing all the current task that has already been created beforehand. That's it. That's simply it is. That's simply what it is, right? So for if condition, I've added another else condition contrary to that, where I'm specifying I just want to see every current task that I created so far. And one more interesting thing to note over here is that how did I order them? What's the order over here? Did I order them by number? Because I'm not seeing any number over here, right? The date would be the order over here, right? So it's arranged based on the date of each task at hand. How did I make that happen? We have task create order by my task, which is the class over here for the model we created, the database model, and we added in the creative, which is the line for the date over here, right? So this is how I'm ordering my task over here, all the current task over here. And of course, the last line is how we add all the tasks to our index page, right? We return the template of index.html and we're giving all the tasks of that we created, or we're giving all the tasks that we created over here to index.html. That's it. So now that we did all of this, we need to bring this to our index page. Since we already connected the index page to the app over here, but we also need to do the other way around as well. We need to connect our index page to the app as well, the way back. This is how we make that happen over. If you may have noticed before in testing, let's say, the data I've given for the table is just simply a bunch of strings over here. Content, data, more. These are just empty strings. They don't mean anything in particular. I can type whatever I want over here as data. That's it, right? But in this case, for data, I've added in everything that references it back to the app over here. This is how we reference everything that we created in the ad over here, right? So if we need to make this work, if we need to actually add and display our web page, and we need to add and show our current task in our web page, we make a reference back to whatever we coded over here by the task content over here and task created over here. That's how we do it. Right? So this is how we manage to display our date, right? Task.created.time. So we added and created as in the created one over here. This is simply the column where the web page would take in all the dates at which the task is created. And this is how we made that possible. I cannot simply add a string called date like over here and expect a date to visibly appear, right? We need to add in a proper code over here to make that happen, to make the web page display whatever the date is that a new task is created. And this is how I made that possible, right? And task content, that's pretty self-explanatory. This is a task itself, the string with which we write the task. And we have two other options over here, edit and delete, right? Edit and delete. And we created the route over here to delete a task, which references back to the block of code where we actually delete a task, right? This includes all the logic we need to actually delete a task. And we made a route for that over here so that it can be connected to our index page, our home page, right? So it's not only enough that we need to create the code over here, it needs to be referenced back here. We need a route for that back over here. And this task.id, you can see over here, this is our route back to our app page where we created the logic to actually delete a task or actually edit a task too, depending on what we need, of course. And these are the routes that we just made for that. Since we created a for loop all the way here for task, we are ending the for loop right here, right? So what we essentially did is that we taken the task and the data for the task from here, right? Took the task, we took the task from here. We created our model. We took the data for the task from here, and we created a route for all the tasks we created over there back into our HTML pages. And ultimately, we actually created a for loop for item, which I named the task over here, in past, plural. And I created a for loop and I ended that for loop right here. That's it. So that's the logic of it. And one thing I forgot to mention over here, for example, in date, I don't want to show every unit at a time possible over here, right? So I stripped some of the time over here and I just wanted to display year, month, and day. So that's all I want to display as part of my time at which my task was created. Just as we ended the N4 right here, we also have an if condition right here. So we also need to make sure to end the if over here using another template block as well. Since we're creating all these conditions, we also have to, it's just basic just syntax over here. We're also ending the conditions with another end if, right? And down here, for example, I've already mentioned that we are referencing the form over here to just bring the input all the way from index to over here so that it can be processed and added to the database. And in order to return all that data from there, from app over here, we need to bring it back to index again, as I mentioned over here. For example, we made a route over here for editing and deleting. Just like that, I'm also creating a route back to index page over here from the form, right? Form is where I created all the input, the buttons for input, and I also created a route back to the home page, and as well as I created a method, the method over here as well. The method in this case is post. So in forms, I'm giving it an action basically, which is the index homepage. I just reference the index homepage over here as an action. And as a method, I gave it post. Like I told you before, we are giving the server or the database data in the name of text or like as a task. Like we're giving data to the database in order to create our task. So we have our form over here complete. This just completes it, you know? So once we added the method, the post, and like all these things together make it complete. It just shows us as visual as it is without any problems or errors. So every line of code over here simply completes our index page to the point where we won't have to face any errors, right? And going back to our delete, now let's go to our delete route over here, right? So how does this work? We created a function over here, delete, and we're deleting based on our ID. What is our ID? It's an integer, as I mentioned before. Our ID is recognized by a key primary value, which happens to be an integer, right? So we have our delete and we are deleting by our ID, which is based on an integer. So that's how we're doing it. Our web page is identifying tasks to delete or edit based on their ID. For example, if I delete this, this is working because it is identifying our task based on its unique integer value or its unique ID value, right? So in this case, deleting a task, as I mentioned over here, is gonna be an object of our model. The model over here is my task, as I mentioned over here before. And this delete is gonna be an object of that particular model itself. And over here we have a query, and we're gonna get for 404. What does this mean? Means that it's either gonna happen, it's either gonna delete, or it's gonna show a 404 error, right? But the chances of it showing error is very unlikely because the delete is only visible if it's visible on the table itself. So the chances of us getting an actual 404 is not there. So, but yeah, we made a query and we added the get or 404, and we are recognizing the task using ID over here again. As I mentioned before, we are deleting by ID. So I added an ID over here again. But what is the line over here? As I mentioned before, when we added a task, we created a session with the database, we added a new task, just like that. The same logic is applied over here and here as well in edit 2, where we create a session with the database, we give the task to the database, and we commit that to the database. Once we commit that to the database, this logic over here is pretty much the same repeated, as much as simple as that. We return back to the index, we return and redirect back to the home page. And I've added the except condition because we added try over here, right? So the logic after this, the logic from try is pretty much similar for all three tasks at hand, like deleting a task, editing, adding a new task. We have the same logic repeated over here 3 times. That's it. We're creating the session with the database, and we're committing and we are redirecting back to our home page. And as you know, as I mentioned before, we also need to bring this all the way back. All of this, the delete logic over here, all of this back to index. As you can see over here, I've added task.id. But how does this work? How does me simply typing task.id into curly braces, bringing all this logic back here? I've added a route over here. That's how it does it. So we've added the route over here as an app route, and in that we added delete. This is how we're making delete work over here. Just like I've added a route for the home page over here and as part of the decorator, I've added also another route over here for the delete. Another thing important that you need to make sure is that you need to make sure these URLs, these links, match the ones over here. As I made that mistake before, if you, for example, write something else instead of delete over here and write delete over here, it's not going to match. It's not going to work. So the URLs, the routes back over here, it needs to be the same word. So over here in this case, why do I have two methods? The reason for that would be, okay, so how does the logic of edit actually work, right? We're editing by ID over here, as you can see. ID, ID, which is identified by a unique integer. And we also created a route over here, right? Like a URL for editing. We made that. But what is exactly happening when we edit stuff, right? For one thing, we're actually going to a different page. Let's say over here, for example, let's say read, right? And I edit that. Okay, there you go. So what actually happened over here? A lot of processes took place together to make this work, right? There's a lot of thing happening behind the scenes to make this happen, right? So if you go over here, we are actually doing two things. We are going to a different page. We are going inside the task. We are editing and tweaking the task, and we're returning back to the home page. As you can see, return redirect. We are returning back to the route of the home page over here. So I've also created a new HTML file called edit.html. So edit.html. Okay, there you go. And inside this, I've extended, of course, the template from the base HTML, and I injected all that code over here so that I wouldn't have to bother typing all the basic boilerplate and such. And I made this into a template and I've added edit everything I need in the HTML file to make the edit work. So this is the code behind the edit page. If you go over here and if you edit it, we go to a different page to edit it, and this is the route for that, by the way. And we're going into a different HTML file, HTML page in this case, to edit the task. And this is the HTML file behind that. So I created a new HTML file and I've added the same values over here for input, by the way. As you can see over here in form, these two inputs, I didn't change the values of it over here. I didn't want to create any extra complications regarding that. So I created two same inputs over here to make the edit work. And once the editing over here is done in this page, it redirects back to the home page after committing the edit in the database session that I created, right? So that's the logic behind it. So once you do that, you have the same things over here. The request method is post and the task at hand is being requested from form and content. We're making that references, same logic as we used before in delete as well as in add. So the logic is pretty much the same except for the part where we go to a different HTML page to actually edit and come back. So that's about it. That's the logic. This is the entire logic behind how we actually create a to-do list as a pet project, right? So this is the number of things that happen behind the scenes in this small simple page. So if you go back, wait a minute. So if you go back over here and actually edit it, so see, this is pretty much a simple page by any premise, right? But this is the actual process that is happening behind it. We need this much of code and logic behind it so that it would work without any errors, so that the page itself would work smoothly. This is all we need to make that happen, right? Now that I created the page over here, the only step that remained was to style the page. This actually looked, let's say, uglier than it looked before. It was actually way simpler or rudimentary before by appearance. I made it look like this thanks to my style sheet over here. Where was it? There you go. So as I mentioned before, once you watch back to you watch SAS down here, it will compile the SAS code over here into CSS, into traditional CSS on its own. You won't have to worry about that. And then what I like about SAS over here is that unlike CSS, I could add my variables over here, and then I could use input my color codes over here. So color codes can be found from like Googling. Like you can just type in HTML color codes and find the necessary ones over here as you wish. But once you do that, all I did over here was give different types of variable names and I added the color codes in. So I just had to use that particular variable name to, add the color over here. For example, title color and primary hover color. So based on what we need over here, we just give out different variable names over here and you can just add in the color you want for that particular variable inside this so that you wouldn't have to type the color code every time you need it in every single line over here. And for example, if you look at this, for example, content, in a normal CSS file, we need to use content for each tag, for example, content H1, content H4, content table, and it goes on. But in SAS, for example, we can actually group all the tags that we bring under content in one single curly braces. So we open curly braces after content, we reference content using the dot operator over here, and then we bring every tags out there that is included in this content in a single space. You don't have to keep referencing content like this every time in in SAS, just like that. It's more convenient like that. But if you do not prefer using SAS, you could just use CSS traditionally. It doesn't matter. Yeah, once you've finished designing the font, the margin, padding, and as well as whatever specifications you need for the content itself, content being the actual page over here, the task and everything that you see over here, including the small highlights behind the table, the color of the font over here, the font itself. Once you design all of that over here, that's pretty much it. There you go. Your CRUD project is complete. So once you finish the code over here, you just need to refine it by appearance using CSS, SAS, whatever. And that's about it. You've created your first to-do list and your first CRUD project.
That was another inspiring project from our AI Internship program at Schogini. If you're ready to kickstart your own AI journey, whether you're a beginner or a coder, join our online internship today. Visit shogini.com/AI-internship and take your first step towards becoming an AI innovator. Don't forget to subscribe and keep learning with us here on Techie Talks AI.